I wanted to start really by just asking you how you ended up making the film about the perpetrators and what you were doing in Indonesia.
So I went to Indonesia for the first time in 2001. Um, I was developing kind of experimental participatory documentary methods with collaborators here in London. And I had a friend who was putting together a labor education program for the International Union of Food and Agricultural Workers. And they wanted a feature length documentary about globalization made using kind of very engaging kind of experimental methods, um, dealing with made by workers who were struggling, were dealing with real oppression and struggling to organize a union in a place where unions had very recently been illegal. And I could have been sent to Bangladesh, to India, to Colombia, or to Indonesia, and I was sent to Indonesia. I knew nothing about Indonesia at the time. I found myself in a plantation village about 50 miles from the city of Medan, where I made the act of killing. And I found that the biggest obstacle that this community had in organizing a union was fear. Fear because there had been a strong union until 1965. The people I was working with to make this film, their parents, aunts, uncles, grandparents had been in this union, had been accused of being sympathetic to the communists because they were in a union. Some were communists, some were not. And they were put in concentration camps and then dispatched by the army out to be killed. And I really didn't know much about this at all at that time. But it was clear that because fear was their sort of biggest obstacle, we would have to talk about that in the film. And as we started to talk about it, it turned out we were being monitored by the authorities filming in this community because the survivors' families, the relatives of the relatives of the victims, had been designated officially as unclean by the Indonesian government, and were under surveillance. And there was a mole within our group who was reporting what we were talking about. So we started being arrested. Our equipment started to be taken, and every time we would film together, we would get stopped by a combination of the plantation managers, the military, and the police. And it was scary, especially for the survivors. But we persevered and we made the film. But we didn't go too much into what had happened in 1965. And my next door neighbor in that village was an old man who one day invited me in for tea. And I went in for tea. He was curious who I was as a foreigner living in this village. And I said, what did you do for a living? He was in his late 70s, and he immediately started telling me stories about how he immediately said I was promoted from being the security guard on this plantation to the manager of the plantation because I wiped out the communists here. And I said, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, I killed 200 labor union members by beating them up and drowning them in irrigation ditches. And he didn't say it with the tone of a confessional, but like Anwar on the roof at the beginning of the film, he was boastful. And he told it sort of laughing, pointing out how his muscles are no longer quite what they used to be, with his 10-year-old granddaughter watching on board as though she'd heard this many times before. And I felt at that point something clicked where I realized it's as though we're in Nazi Germany 40 years on after the end of World War II, and the Nazis are still in power. And I think that's when I realized that I was stuck in a way. I would have to give this situation whatever it demanded of me for as long as it took. I felt it laid a claim to me and to my life in a way. So I finished this first film, and then very quickly went back. That film was done from start of production to the end of editing in 6 months. I went back right away and started filming. This is now 2002, 2003, filming with the survivors, and we were still getting stopped all the time, and it was still frightening for people. So then I reached out to the Indonesian human rights community in Jakarta, which I wasn't connected to because I'd been sent by this international union to this fairly out-of-the-way plantation region. And so me and a group of survivors went down to Jakarta, and we said, should we be making this film? Is it too dangerous? Is it too sensitive? Is this a bad idea? And everybody in the human rights community said, well, let us see the film that you've made already. They saw it, they saw this boastful perpetrator, and they said, no, this is extremely important. You have to continue. You have to fundamentally expose the nature of a whole regime built on the celebration of genocide. And we couldn't really think of a safe way to film with the survivors. In fact, I wasn't making an ordinary documentary with the survivors. As I said, my methods were already, I've always been a filmmaker I don't come from a documentary background, and I'm not at all wedded to the notion of observational documentary, and I think Fly on the Wall is a fiction. It's a narrative it's a story we tell about our observational documentaries so that viewers can suspend their disbelief and appreciate the film as it's meant to be appreciated, but it's a fiction. Every time we film anybody, we create reality with that person. And so the film I was trying to make with the survivors involved working with these kind of there were forms of village theater and opera which had been banned, the practitioners of which had been put in concentration camps, many of them killed, some allowed to live, and then released many years later. And I was trying to work with them to sort of resuscitate that form and tell the story of what had happened to them as a kind of effort to recover what had been lost in collaboration with the plantation workers with whom I'd made the previous film. So they said, you must continue, but we don't know how you can continue to work with such a vulnerable, exposed community of survivors. But then the main character in that film, in the first film, said, why don't you continue to film the perpetrators? They will continue to boast, and in their boasting, the audience will see exactly why we're so afraid, and they'll see the nature of this regime. So I started filming every perpetrator I could find across the region. I understood that I was fascinated I understood this man wasn't crazy, although he looked crazy, the first one. And I felt, okay, I should film more and show that he's not crazy and expose that this is impunity. And also, as I film more of them, I started to realize I'm now finding out what happened to the dead. Because if you want to know about a crime, if the families of the survivors didn't know what happened to their relatives. They didn't know. It was that relatives were taken away, they never came back. And for that reason, they never even they never felt right. They felt guilty, grieving, because they didn't know what had happened to their loved ones. So the perpetrators knew what happened, and so I felt from them I was getting these facts of world historical importance. We're talking about the deaths of up to hundreds of thousands of people in this one province. That's probably high, but certainly tens of thousands. At one clearing on a riverbank where I was filming, 10,500 people had been killed. So I felt I had this his moral and political responsibility to film everybody I could find. I worked my way across the region. Everybody was open, like the first man I'd met. Everyone was boastful and apparently proud, but I think the boasting cover is defensive in hindsight. It's not real pride. And I worked my way up the chain of command to the city of Medan. Anwar was the 41st perpetrator killer with whom I filmed. Then I continued up the chain of command to men like the newspaper boss and some retired army generals who never made it into the act of killing, and even some retired CIA officers living outside of DC who tried to support the killings as they happened.
Wow. The other thing I wanted to ask you, is that it could be seen as these are barbaric foreigners who behave in a particular way, because, say, Obama would never be coming out quite as brazenly as the vice president to say, yes, we send these drones, we kill people, we assassinate people, we've killed millions of people, and you could say that that's a story of the victors as well. And, that it might be possible to say, well, these are exotic other people who do things differently from us.
I think I felt that I was tasked by the survivors to expose a regime of impunity primarily for Indonesians. Yeah. And in that sense, the fact that the film is working outside of Indonesia, and I was making a film that an Indonesian filmmaker couldn't make, but in collaboration with a great many wonderful Indonesians. And what needed to be exposed for Indonesians was this boasting about the killings was, but I think it's, I think there's sort of two sort of narratives about two ways of talking about the killings in Indonesia by perpetrators and by people in power that are complementary. I think there's an official discourse where, if you look at the school curriculum, for instance, where the killings aren't talked about hardly at all, except in the most general term, the extermination of the Communist Party. They don't talk about extermination of communist people, the eradication of the Communist Party as something heroic, but they never go into the details of murder, because everybody, everywhere, knows that what you're hearing here is wrong. And then so if you were to talk to the president of Indonesia or vice president in a formal interview setting, they would not boastfully talk about acts of mass killing. The perpetrators, the actual executioners, death squad leaders, people who were involved with the killings have been, I think, encouraged to boast about what they've done ever since in their kind of in an unofficial way, so that as a way of maintaining them as feared proxies of the state. If you imagine go back to this example of, or this hypothetical of the Nazis having won. If you walked into Germany 40 years on and the Nazis had won and rebuilt normal business relationships with all the countries they failed to conquer, presumably, as Himmler himself said, the central government would not be boasting about the Holocaust. But it wouldn't be surprising if SS officers who'd been involved had been, given that they got away with it, been able to go back to their communities and boast, enjoy their status as heroes, tell war stories, tell about these moments that, as we were talking about in the break, Penny, were probably the most thrillingly exhilarating moments in these men's lives, even if in those moments they were destroying themselves, in the sense that when you kill someone, you have this exorbitant power that you probably never have again. So these, both as a kind of spoil of victory, these men are allowed to boast about what they've done, the mid-ranking SS officers, and it serves the purpose of keeping people afraid. And I think it also serves the purpose of assuaging the conscience of those people, because Obama doesn't operate the drone technology, and of course the drone technology is already hyper-mediated, where there's this video game-like interface, so that the drone pilot never is distanced technologically, and through the interface of a video game, really, from the act of killing. In the same way that Anwar used movies and acting to distance himself from the act of killing, or the first 30 killers I met used a bottle of whiskey to distance themselves from the act of killing. So I think, once you've killed, if you've killed, I think you need to somehow, that moment, if it haunts you, which I think it almost always does, you have to somehow tell stories about it so that you can live with it. And it's not enough to just say, oh yes, it's not enough to skip over the killings because it haunts you. It's why Anwar, when he watches the waterfall scene at the end of the film, says it's so beautiful, so deep, so fantastic, but he needs to see the killing. He needs to put that right. So he says, now let me see the scene where the wire's around my neck. It's this kind of need to talk about it. And so I think that somehow the boasting, just to continue on this, I think the boasting serves this defensive purpose. Adi says in the film, if you've killed, it's the worst thing you can do. But do it if you're paid well enough. But then you need a good excuse. Tell yourself a good excuse. Well, here the government provides an excuse. And the killers cling to that excuse for dear life. And if you're not confident in the excuse, if you don't quite believe it, then you become more strident, and justification spills over into celebration. And I think the paradox that I didn't recognize necessarily even for much of the shoot, but I was feeling in the subtext of the characters, the paradox in the act of killing is that this boasting, which appears to be a sign of their lack of remorse and seems barbaric, is in fact probably very often the opposite, a sign that it's a defensive insistence that what they did was right. And the tragedy there is that, in that sense, it's a sign of their humanity. If you and I had killed, I'm sure if we got away with it and had been encouraged to do it, and we would, and if, I'm not saying we would necessarily do it, but if we did, I'm quite sure we would justify it to ourselves if we could, so that we wouldn't have to wake up in the morning, look in the mirror, and see a murderer. So these people kill, and then they boast about it, they justify it, they celebrate it to reassure themselves it was okay. That's their humanity. But that's a sign of their humanity. The tragedy is that once you've done that, it demands that you commit further evil. Because it demands that you keep the victims' families suppressed so they don't challenge your version of the story. It also demands, therefore, that you blame them for what happened, so then it's fair game to exploit them, to extort them, to steal their land, as you hear about in the film and see to some extent. And it almost demands that you kill again, because now if you've told me to kill for this reason one person, now you say, now kill that person for the same reason. Well, if I don't do it, it's like admitting it was wrong the first time.
Yeah. I mean, I've had, with the people that I know through work that I've done with gangs and so on, when people tell stories about shootings, they're always very excited. And it's a narrative in which people are very hyped up, and even when afterwards they say, oh, well, it was wrong and I don't do that anymore, it's always a very, very exciting story, and it's very heightened. Did you ever feel, I mean, I'm a fan of the film, so I didn't particularly, but I know that some people felt that you'd gone too far with filming and not challenging at any point what people were saying or doing.
I think I think that I do challenge them at very key moments, and they challenge themselves. So, I mean, there's this scene in the car with Adi where I'm really arguing with him. There's the scene, of course, at the end where Anwar, I think at the end of the film, because, if you like, at the end of the film, Anwar gives me this kind of dishonest confession. I now feel what my victims feel. To which I responded honestly and said, I don't think you do. And if you're a filmmaker, you'll know that there's a million things that can distract you in such a moment. And you can think, oh, this is an important line, and say nothing. It could be lights, it could be microphones, whatever. I was very fortunate in that moment that nothing was distracting me, and I heard the line and I felt my immediate rejection of it, and I acted on that. I think that leads to something genuine right afterwards. I think there, for me, knowing him for so many years, the bottom falls out for him, and it's in that moment somehow where he realizes that he'll never be able to bridge the gap, the abyss between the horror that he's put people through and the stories he's told himself throughout the film, and all the acting, all the posturing that he's been doing throughout the film to sort of reassure himself that what he did was only a movie. And you said in the break, and I'll then come a little more to your question, you said in the break that people, that some of the perpetrators you've met will talk about feeling like they were the star of a movie when they were committing violence. And maybe Anwar felt like the star of the movie when he was committing violence, and he was acting, and he talks about being intoxicated by whatever movie he'd just seen. I think that forever after, he's been trying to reassure himself that he was just the star of a movie, and that he wasn't actually in the process destroying another human being and himself. But I think I'm not a filmmaker who will stop at nothing to get what I want, or to just to show something. So there's a few places in the film which tread a line for me, or walk a line for me, very much on the edge. One of them is when they go around the market collecting money from people. There I was aware that if we go with Herman and Safit with cameras, the Chinese shopkeepers will now feel, my gosh, they're so powerful, they have their own TV crew. And it almost felt like, is this a snuff film, like going and filming crimes? And I said that to my crew, and my crew said, you have no option, you must film this. This happens in every market in Indonesia. Please film this. Every day it's happening, you've got to film it. So I thought, how can I do this? And so what I did was I told Herman and Safit to move along after each extortion, and I lingered behind. I said I was going to get a release form signed, but the release form was immaterial. What I was doing was telling people why we were there, and I was paying everybody back. And that was a very expensive shoot, because we shot about 30 of these extortions, and each one's paying about $50, so it was a lot of money we had to pay back to do that. Another one that was tough there's one place where the audience often some people in the audience get worried is when they attack the village. For me, that's an interesting place because I think Anwar starts to feel a real trauma there, and the temporality starts to blur. He says he's talking as though what he's doing next, what the killings are happening in the present tense. In reality, of course, the village is a set. All of the children are the children of and grandchildren of the Panchasila youth members and the perpetrators themselves, and the kids have been auditioned for their ability to cry. That's why, although they're crying, the adults afterwards are not particularly concerned. Herman gets a little embarrassed that Febby won't stop crying. The violence kind of looked like this. That's why we're shooting through long lenses and with fire, and which I love. It's a 1970s war movie trick, and I love that we're using genre to kind of create an icon as powerfully as possible for a genocide for which there's no icons, and also deconstructing that because it's obscene to have an icon for a genocide with what I think we do with the sound there. But there is an interesting thing. There's a woman who looks like she's fainted. An Indonesian viewer will say that she's kesurupan, or possessed, and they're doing a ritual to dispel the ghost. She's the wife of the guy on the talk show who says God hates the communists and there'll be no reconciliation. But she's old enough to remember some of this, and it could be that there's a real trauma that she's expressing there. But so for me, that's a scene that looks worse than it is, I suppose. And then the final one, which warrants discussion, which is really an error of omission, not commission, but an error, is the stepson of the Chinese guy who tells his story and then plays the victim. That's a scene that when we were shooting in the studios, in those sound stages, I would have we'd have 5 or 6 cameras shooting at once, and I was in another part of the studio filming Adi and didn't hear the story, and we were filming on tape. It was the days of tape, and we came back from that shoot. We filmed, came back from that shoot with 560 hours of footage, and it takes a year to watch that much footage. So we worked through it editing down the key scenes, and then went through logging all the side conversations to see if we'd missed anything, and lo and behold, there was this story. And I thought, oh my gosh, if I'd heard this story, then I knew he'd played the victim, and when he cries, he was introduced to me as a member of the Panchasila Youth Theater Troupe, which Herman had also been in, playing roles in drag. That's the backstory to Herman in drag. That theater troupe had closed down before, and not because Herman's gay. I think Herman, it's funny because he's not gay. We all know he's not gay. But it was all the roles in the paramilitary theater group it was all men, so the women's roles were played by men too. That theater troupe had closed down before I arrived, or else I would have worked with them more. But I was introduced to him as a good actor and a member of the paramilitary group. And so when I edited those reenactments and I'd seen him crying, I thought it was acting, it was fake, it was melodrama, and I actually cut it out because I thought it's wrong for the false to come into a scene where there's so much real, where you have real killers teaching younger members of their movement how to torture. Then I came across that story a year later, felt awful. Thought I should have taken him, if I'd known, I would have taken him aside and said, why are you here? Wait a minute, don't tell me. Stay the rest of the day behind the camera with me, and tomorrow say you're sick, don't come back. And I called the key people in my Indonesian crew and asked if anyone had heard that, and apparently they hadn't. My cinematographer had been shooting it, but he didn't speak Indonesian. So no one knew it. And then when I put the film together, I felt really tainted, dirty. It was something I really would have stopped. And I called him. I found an old call sheet. This is now 2.5 years after the shoot when we had a rough cut. And called him, and his wife answered and said that he had in fact passed away 2 years after the shooting, 6 months before I called, from complications of diabetes. And I asked her why he was in the film. Did he ever talk about it? She said he talked about it all the time and was waiting really for it to come out, and was in the film because, had done it because he had had this awful experience as a child and wanted to show that to the world and share the horror of that. And in that sense, he wanted to be there, and I'm glad he's there and that he succeeded in his mission, if you like. But if that happened again, I would still take him out, even if he had a good reason for being there.
It's very interesting, the sort of juxtaposition of sometimes kind of quite bad acting and, as you say, pretend violence with the documentary footage of people confessing to these things. I've never seen that before, and it was really amazing and
we played with the
inventive,
false,
yeah,
that this is
yeah.
fake, this is,
Yeah.
and then so the real would
Yeah.
hit with greater
Yeah.
force.
This is a random question, but what is that fish?
Can you ask me that at the very end? Can you
Okay,
remember? Because that's
I
a
will.
lovely note to
All
leave
right.
on.
Okay.
Because it's going to take us in a random but
All right.
poetic direction.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you to break down these 10 years that you spent making it. What was filming? What was editing?
Sure.
How you made these choices?
Sure. It's 10 years since I started this. After I made the globalization tapes, the first film I made there, and went back and started to make The Act of Killing. The globalization tapes was made. It was a kind of experiment in filming where the plantation workers were also co-authors of the film. So although, yeah, when I wouldn't include that part of the work in this, in that I wasn't feeling, I was more of a facilitator than a director of that film. I went back a decade ago, from 2003, 2004, I was trying to work with the survivors, and I would film, as I talked about earlier, on this kind of Ludruk opera form. We would film 3 months, come back with a lot of footage, work through it, go back and film more. That was 4 months, 5 months, 6 months later, depending on whether we had funding to raise or whether we could just go right back. That was really 2003. I was also developing a project in the States, so it wasn't full time then. I sort of date the beginning of The Act of Killing to the preparation for the shoot wherein I met Anwar. So that's 2005. So it's really 8 years ago now, or a little over 7 years from when I finished it. 7.5 years when I finished all the versions of the film in post-production. So 2004 is when I started working really with the perpetrators. There were 2 very big shoots in 2004, and one at the beginning of 2005 where I was working my way across the region, filming every perpetrator I could find. There, what I was telling, every perpetrator there was, as I said, like Anwar, the scene at the roof where Anwar does the dance is the very first day I filmed with him. The second day I met him. That was typical. I would meet people, they would boast immediately, and then they would say, I guess you want to see where this happened, or where we dumped the bodies, or whatever. And I would say yes, because as I said, these facts felt really of world historical importance to me. So there was a lot of footage with these kind of simple reenactments like Anwar on the roof at the beginning. And very often after that, people would sort of complain, oh, I should have brought a machete to use as a prop, or friends.
Worn different trousers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they would say that came, or worn different trousers. Those kind of requests to improve it would come. But I was still working my way across, not so much because I was looking for the right character to follow. It wasn't a casting process per se. It was more I felt this was a huge event, and I needed to understand it. There was no researcher who had previously told me how the killings had been carried out in North Sumatra. I wasn't working on the back of newspaper reports or an anthropologist's work or a historian's work. No one had researched it. No one had recorded this before. So I was working my way across the region and getting lots of these simple reenactments. And after the 10th or 15th, because everybody was so open, I realized, okay, what I want to understand is not so much anymore what happened, I'm getting that, but why are they so open? Mm-hmm. What is the purpose of their boasting? For whom are they boasting? How do they expect to be seen? What is the function of their boasting? I knew from making the film with the survivors they were boasting to the relatives of their own victims, presumably to terrorize them. Why? How did they think I would hear it? Would I be impressed? Would I think they're heroes? Do they really think they are of themselves as heroes? So I started to become interested in fundamentally these questions of the imagination, and I started screening the footage back to people to see if they would recognize something in the mirror of the footage that they didn't recognize, of which they were in denial when they were reenacting. So but also after, let's say, the 15th or 20th, I don't remember, some way in, I started being very, very open to people. At first I was quite ginger, and what did you do for a living, and sort of what was your childhood like, trying to see if they would open up. But because everyone was so open, I would just say, look, you've participated in one of the biggest killings in human history. Your society's built on it. Your life has been shaped by it. You want to show me what you've done, and if I want to understand what it means to you, to your society, how you want to be seen, how you see yourself. So show me what you've done in whatever way you want, and I'll film the process, I'll film the reenactments, and we'll combine this material and create a kind of, I don't know where this will lead, it depends what you want to show me, but it'll be a kind of new form of documentary, a documentary of the imagination as opposed to a documentary of your everyday lives. It doesn't just have to be the killings, it can be your scenes showing your feelings about the killings, and I will and that's what we'll do. So in a way, I was the method, the approach was very open after a fairly short time, and was a response to their openness. So the method and form of the film is a response to their openness. It wasn't a kind of curious lure to get them to open up. And of course, they're therefore not making another film. They're not making some fictional film of which I follow the making of. They're making scenes for the act of killing. And they know that from the beginning. Otherwise, it would never have worked, and it would have been far too hard to balance the needs of a feature film, which if any of you make fiction, you would know that's a big project. That's almost a superhuman project on its own, especially if there's musical numbers and whatnot, with the needs of my film. So it was I had to be open from the beginning, and my openness was a way of trying to understand their openness, and a way of getting close to them, because I also think I can't make an honest film about another human being without being close. So 2004, beginning of 2005, I was filming with all these perpetrators, and the story or the approach was developing. As I said, I met Anwar in the summer of 2005, and the film is fairly chronological. The big thing that's not chronological is that the very high-ranking politicians. They were filmed at the very end when we knew we had the movie, because we knew that any one of them could question us and get us kicked out. Because as I said, there is a central government narrative which doesn't talk about this. Yeah. And you could say, but then what about the talk show? They're so open on the talk show. Well, that's regional North Sumatran television, or regional Sumatran television. That's a pretty big deal, but it's because the governor was already involved with making the film, the newspaper publisher was making the film, all the paramilitary leaders from the province were making the film. You could say the film distorted the discourse in North Sumatra, where the state TV talk show crew or director knew about the film because state television had let us use their studios, their soap opera studios in Medan to shoot Anwar's Nightmare and the scenes with Adi, and therefore state TV was aware of it and knew it was a big story, that there was this film being made with the governor and so on. The governor was actually already in the film. And so they decided to make, and so then they said, how about we make a talk show? I guess feeling like if these men are so open, I guess we've been too cautious. And maybe we can talk about this openly. So the talk show, that means, is as shocking for Indonesian viewers, at least non-Indonesian viewers from outside of North Sumatra, as it is for you guys. It's just there was a kind of distortion in the public discourse around, and I think vanity plays a part of it. People wanting to participate, and also this peculiar position of gangsters and thugs. North Sumatra is a province run by thugs. Well, gangsters' capital is fear. You know, you can go around the market getting money from people, but if they're not afraid of you, they're not going to give you any. So and because there's gangsters in the government, like you see in the deputy minister and the vice president to an extent, they also have to maintain a frightening image. So once I met Anwar, it's fairly chronological, but for the of course the opening sequence with the fish and water falls out of time, and the opening audition in the street is is out of time as well, and that's so that we can set up from the very outset the filmmaking project without having to tell you my whole narrative of going and meeting people. We found when we just provided the information in a text and then you meet Anwar more or less the way I met Anwar, people forget, and it feels like I'm imposing this method. So in the editing we had to somehow speed up the telling of that. But apart from that, it's quite chronological, except that we're interleaving Anwar's filmmaking process with the politicians early on in order to tell the story of Anwar and what he did and the filmmaking method, apace with this presenting this corrupt regime, both of which you need in order to understand what follows. I would shoot for 3 months, 4 months at a time. I'd come back. I think there were 8 big shoots. I would come back with anywhere between 100 hours at the least to 600 hours. At the most, there was 1,400 hours of material. At the end, it was a hell of an edit
The whole
process.
thing.
Yeah. At the end of the shooting, I would come back when you have so much material. I would often know I had to get back to continue with them before I would have time to watch everything. So sometimes I would just log the key scenes, based on memory, and then go back for the next part of the production. But 6 months would elapse. We would have to raise money. Anwar's hair would grow out again. That's why it's changing color all the time. It's not because it's all shuffled around the chronology. It's that gaps would come, and then he would shave it. I shave my hair. He would dye it again before a big fiction scene, but he wouldn't dye it for this sort of more observational stuff. So that's that. And then we would and then I came back, and then I felt I needed to go through everything, so I went through all the material. I had a team in Indonesia who then logging and syncing the multiple cameras.
You speak the language,
that's
right?
me, of course, behind the camera speaking the language. And then there was about 3 years of editing where 2 assistants came from Indonesia over. One of them is the guy who, in the end, I credited as a co-director, the anonymous co-director. They came to England for a year and a half. We had a year and a half with 2 editors working side by side in London, cutting this 1,400 hours down to 23 hours of edited scenes. There were a couple reasons for that. One was because the material's so layered and dense that I felt I needed to address all of the important scenes. I couldn't foresee. It's so, I feel what I love about film is that it's sort of smarter than me. The material's smart. If a picture tells 1,000 words, well, a moving picture tells 24,000 words a second. And here you have all these different layers. You have, like, for example, when Anwar plays the victim, you have this touching and disturbing scene of a victim being tortured. And then you have this double take that you do because it's the perpetrator being tortured. And then you have this other layer because you know everything that's come before. And then you have this other layer because it's done as a kind of weird film noir, stylized in this strange way. So I felt I couldn't understand. And then you have this other layer because actually some real trauma is surfacing during the scene, because of the stylization. So I felt I needed to really edit all of the important scenes, and also to find a coherent language for the film, despite the eclecticness of the material. It's so eclectic. There's, on the one hand, each of the scenes, if you look at the burning village, it's cut in with these very fast shots and a very stylized sound design. And then you look at, the scene with Herman brushing his teeth, totally other end of the spectrum. It's cut very differently. Or the final scene, which is just one shot of Anwar on the roof. So I felt I needed to find the language of the film that would have a coherent point of view, but also allow for the fact that I understood the film would not remain a documentary over its course. At some point, as Anwar's own sense of time, past and present, would blur, there'd be a kind of getting lost in Anwar's nightmare, and it would become a kind of fever dream that maybe crashes back into reality at the end. So all of that, so there was this year and a half of editing in to get all these scenes, to find the language, and then there was a year of editing in Denmark to reach this with one editor.
So 4 years.
Three years of editing, including the post-production.
Right.
So it was about
That's
3
amazing.
years of editing and post-production.
Would anybody like to ask a question now? Or yeah?
Just wondered from your perspective of being on the ground, where do you foresee if they're ever going to move towards what they seem to fear more than communism, which is any form of democracy?
Maybe this is a good moment to tell you a little bit about the film's life in Indonesia.
Yeah.
I would just say one thing about it. It is a booming economy, and it's tempting to look at the film as some kind of far-off world where, this alternative reality where perpetrators have won and have built a new morality on the basis of total impunity. That's very different from our morality, but ordinary Indonesians think killing is wrong and are mortified by it and disturbed by the film, just as we are. And ordinary Indonesians, and I think what we have to remember is that this is in fact not a distant reality. This is the underbelly of our reality. Everything we buy is haunted by the suffering of the people who make it for us. Every article of clothing on my body is made in a place where the workers, like those plantation workers I started with, who were trying to organize a union because they were spraying a herbicide which was dissolving their livers, and it was killing them. In fact, the day I went to the premiere of the film, I was flying from LA to Telluride Film Festival for the premiere of the film, I get a call that the woman who suggested that I film with perpetrators, that she died from liver disease. So everything we buy is haunted by the suffering of the people who make it for us, and they're all working in places where there's been mass political violence, perpetrators have won, they've built a regime of fear on the basis of their victory, and that's why workers all around the world, across the global south, cannot get the human costs of everything we buy incorporated into the price tag that we pay. So in a way, we depend on this reality for our everyday living, and just as Anwar and his friends by the end of the film may have escaped justice but have not escaped punishment, in that they're either totally hollow and destroy and empty from what they've done, or from the kind of killing of their own conscience that they've had to do to live with it, on the one hand, or they're ravaged by it, in the case of Anwar, and sort of teetering through the rest of their lives. We too are damaged, I think, by living lives that depend on other people's suffering. I don't say we all as individuals are personally responsible. We're damaged. We need to take action as individuals, and collectively especially, but we are damaged because we have only one chance to live in the world. We have only one life, and it's a great shame that we live it on the backs of others, and it means, I think, that we withdraw from the world into cheap delusions of good guys versus bad guys, what I call the Star Wars morality, where we think we're good, where we think we're well equipped to judge other human beings, not just their actions, which we must do, but them as entire beings. When in fact, so we are we are sort of guests at Anwar and his friends' cannibalistic feast, and we're not as. So I guess to now just come to the life of the film in Indonesia, it's been not so different from the life of the film in the West, in that it holds a dark mirror up to everybody. In Indonesia,
and it's been shown. Now,
yeah, they ban films in Indonesia, and so we knew if we gave it to the Film Censorship Board before it had any support in Indonesia, it would certainly be banned. So what we did was we held screenings and we knew if it's banned, it becomes a crime to show the film, and if it's a crime to show the film, then the army can attack screenings, or the paramilitary group can attack screenings with impunity. So we held screenings all last autumn at the National Human Rights Commission in Jakarta. I would say that everybody who saw that, we invited Indonesia's leading journalists, news producers, publishers, filmmakers, historians, writers, educators, artists, human rights advocates, survivors groups. I can say everyone was very, very moved by the film, but also really loved the film in some way, and said we have to do something with this film. Most importantly, perhaps, Indonesia's leading news news publisher, the publisher of the biggest news magazine in Indonesia, Tempo, decided, was sort of watch this film, and if you're the head of the biggest news magazine in a country like Indonesia, of course you're part of the establishment. And you're in late middle age, and you see Adi and Anwar just a bit older than you, destroyed by what they've done or living lives that are just not livable. And you're faced with a kind of stark choice. Do you want to grow old, somehow a perpetrator, or do you want to take a stance? And the film moved some of these guys, to particularly the editors of Tempo magazine, to say they have to break their decades-long silence about the killings, and they felt they should marshal fresh evidence before doing so. So they sent journalists all over the country, dozens of journalists, in September, looking to see essentially, is the act of killing a repeatable experiment? Could they find boastful killers? And they, to their horror, but I don't think to their surprise, they found that everywhere they sent a journalist, the journalist could simply enter a neighborhood and said who was doing the killing here. And everybody knew, because the killers had been boasting ever since. The army everywhere had recruited criminals to do the killings, or to help with the killings, to help with the dirty work of the army, rewarded them with power and encouraged them to sort of make themselves feared proxies of the state ever since. So everywhere they found these perpetrators who would boast, and within a few weeks they gathered hundreds of pages of this boasting. They edited it down to 75 pages, commissioned a further 25 pages about the act of killing, and came out with a double issue of their magazine, the act of killing issue, called Stories from 1965 Executioners, back in October last year. And then that really set the tone, whereby the rest of the media, it was so, like the act of killing is shocking, it meant nobody could ignore it. The rest of the media started publishing their own reports, talking about the Tempo magazine edition, talking about the film. And then all the people who'd seen the film in the autumn said we need to show the film. So on International Human Rights Day, December 10th last year, they held 50 screenings in 30 cities. That then has grown exponentially, so every week there's more than the previous week, apart from perhaps that first week. And as of the beginning of spring, there were 500 screenings in 95 cities, and it continues to grow and grow. So the film has come to Indonesia like the child in the Emperor's New Clothes, I would say, pointing at the king, saying the king is naked. Everybody knew it, but had been afraid to say it. But now that it's said so forcefully by the perpetrators themselves, who ought, if they were really heroes, ought to be enjoying their golden years, feeling heroic.
And how did
There's no
Anwar,
going
Adi
back.
and Herman react? Sorry, how did Anwar, Adi and Herman react to the film? They've obviously seen it, haven't they?
Adi, I think has seen the film, but I didn't show it to him because he's quite well connected to very high-ranking politicians, and I knew from what he says in the film that he would hate the film. He says it in the film, that this film will make us look bad, and indeed after he said that on the radio mic, I heard him telling everybody I'm a communist, and I had to address that right away, or it would have been dangerous. And we have that argument in the film, and he leaves in the car, and then he more or less leaves the process. He made one comment, which was just that he never got rich from making the film is going around the world, and why didn't he get rich from it? That's the only comment he made in the media. Herman loves the film. Herman, I think, fell in love with acting while making the film, and developed an actor's loyalty to the truth. And I think to be a good actor, you have to have a loyalty to the emotional and moral truth of any situation, and I think Herman's excellent. And I think also Herman Herman's picked on throughout the film by Anwar. And I think he's, here's a guy who doesn't have who's a promising younger generation of paramilitary leadership. He never makes it big. He's kind of sidelined. He's disappointed, like Anwar in a way, with his not reaching the pinnacle of the organization. He's picked on. He doesn't have great economic prospects, so he's extorting people, which can make you angry. I think Anwar's angry at what hurting people has done to him at the end of the film when he's killing that teddy bear, and when he's torturing Pang in the film noir scene. I think Herman got angry at Anwar. It was just, I think he also because he's acting and he's siding with the victim very often in the scenes. I think what Anwar was saying was appalling, and he wanted to kind of give it back to Anwar. And you see it in the scene with when he's feeding Anwar the organs. You see it with the teddy bear scene where he plays the mother. And of course, you see it when he's killing Anwar at the end. And I think it's that anger that we all feel and know in his subtext that, for me, is why that scene with the drumming works so perfectly at the end. It doesn't work perfectly for everybody, but I continue to love it. So I think that there's this anger in him. And I think when he saw the film, he was delighted to see everything exposed. And he plays this very important role throughout the film of constantly guiding Anwar, sometimes gently, sometimes forcefully, back to his pain when Anwar would get set sort of cold feet. And I think, so when I showed the film to Anwar, which is of course the most important, he was very moved. I think you can't supports, these are support, stands by, these are sort of two trivial words. He saw the film, he was very silent, he was tearful. We sat in silence. I couldn't be there safely anymore in person, so I was there by Skype. But we sat in silence on Skype for a long time after the credits ended, and he was just sitting there. And I felt as though I was gazing into the darkness with him on that fishing platform. And we were like 5 minutes in silence, which is a long time. If I'm talking really 5 minutes. And then he said, yeah, Josh, it shows what it's like to be me, and I'm glad I could make such an honest film. And I will support the film. And I understood that was a kind of strange thing to say, and it made me, I said you shouldn't feel you have to support the film because you could be under pressure from the paramilitary group to denounce the film, so you're not blamed for it. And you should do that if that's what you feel you should do. Or if that's what's safe, please do that. But he hasn't. He saw it on the 1st of November last year, and he and I are in touch, I suppose, every 3 to 4 weeks, ever since.
Given how many people have seen it and people high up officially have responded to it, is there any prospect of any kind of justice?
Well, the government has not responded to the film particularly well. An army general from Central Java. Yeah, I think there's an army general from Central Java threatened people, saying we'll exterminate people who are screening the film. People get threats regularly. I get threats. There was a big the National Human Rights Commission came out with an 850-page report in August, chronicling the killings as a crime against humanity, and recommending tribunals, recommending truth and reconciliation process, recommending a presidential apology. The president had said to the National Human Rights Commission, please write an apology for me, and then I'll summon you to the presidential palace and we'll do it. But then they never were summoned, and they finally found out it was because the army said, there's no way we're going to let you apologize for this. So the Attorney General rejected the report. All the Commission they only have the right to make recommendations, and it's up to the Attorney General whether to accept or to decline, to reject their recommendations. They rejected the whole report, saying the killings were justified because if they hadn't occurred, Indonesia would not be what it is today, which is, of course, darkly what the film shows.
Did you have nightmares?
Yeah, I did. I think one of the hardest things was, I insisted to myself while shooting the film that I will never look at Anwar, I will never denounce Anwar as a person, even though, of course, I denounce these actions. I'll never look at him as a monster. And if as I was shooting I felt real hatred towards him, I would stop and take a day out, take a week out, take whatever I needed out so that I could come back to him as a human being making a film about and with a human being. Getting close to someone makes you vulnerable to that person. And so when he would tell, especially in that sort of final descent into corruption and death in that film noir section of the film, it was horrible. And that's where I finally started to have real nightmares, and my crew did too, and we supported each other and looked as best we could, looked after each other. But I would have these awful nightmares for one night, and then the next day I couldn't sleep because I was afraid of it happening again. The next night I couldn't sleep well either, and then it would start again. And that went on for about 6 months, and it was hard.
Yeah.
Hard.
You can't really digest it, can you? And that's in a way what Anwar is doing with the dry retching. It's that how can you possibly make sense or
I think
live with that?
there's a wonderful thing about that last scene, which is that you notice this, but he has black hair in the scene before it, and then he has white hair again. 6 months went by. It was one of our very last it was in fact our very last shoot. And it was when we were getting all the high-ranking political leaders, and I knew this was it. We were done. And we had been trying to get back into that office again for the last 5 years. Every time I went, we would try and get back in, but the shopkeeper wouldn't let us back in. It had nothing to do with the killings, it turned out. They just had some superstition about photography, and we didn't get it. We tried a lot of money, we just couldn't get back in there. And but I had only been there, so I'd only filmed there once, and you'll appreciate as a director, the first time you film somewhere, with the first time you film someone, it's like research. You don't know the stories. I didn't know any of the things that had happened in that office when I'd filmed there the first time. And then years went by, and we were hearing I was hearing story after story after story that happened in that office, and I didn't know the structure of the film. I thought perhaps it would be really useful to have him walking through the office saying more or less, this happened here, then I did that there, then we did this here. So I actually intended for that scene, it is in fact the very final scene I shot, but I intended it to be out of sequence. And probably before parts of it to be, I didn't even know how much I would respect chronology at that point. But I just expected to use it earlier. So I had asked Anwar, please walk through the space quietly and just say what happened in different rooms. And there's 3 levels. There was the newspaper office, there was the paramilitary office, then that roof. And I think suddenly, I don't know if it was when he saw the wire as he's standing on I don't know what it was, but suddenly it's like he's blindsided by this thing that's happening to his body. And his words have not moved on at all from the beginning of the film. He doesn't have the same swagger as at the beginning. And as I was shooting it, I remember thinking, perhaps this won't work at the end. I mean, early in the film, because he looks older, he looks tired. But suddenly he's blindsided by this retching. And it's as though he's trying to continue. Some people will ask me, is this staged? Because he's talking in this kind of, way like he knows how to talk to the camera, and he's being very coherent, and he's saying he says for the very first time, I knew what I did was wrong, but then he continues and says, but I had to do it, and then he retches, and then it's like he just thinks, I have to continue. It's like he has no idea what's happening to his body. He doesn't want to consciously think about it, because if he thinks about it, it's too horrible. It's the horrible thing he's been running away from the whole time. So he picks himself up and keeps doing what I asked him to do. And then he retches again, and I guess he's probably, if he's thinking about it at all, he's probably thinking, Josh will cut this out. And, of course, it's like he's trying to vomit up the ghosts that haunt him, only to find that somehow he is the ghost, because he is his past. He will never escape what he's done. And there's an interesting thing, since you've seen the director's cut of the film, the final shot is different than in the shorter version of the film. In the shorter version of the film, he walks out of the shop. After I film him I shoot him going down the stairs, and I'm thinking, okay, I'll get him going down the stairs, and then I ran after him and filmed him going out the shop. And I was amazed when he stood there on the landing, thinking, my God, if this was me, I'd want to get the hell out of there. And it was like this unconscious recognition that he'll forever be in limbo, I felt. I had this other thing on the roof. I wanted to put my arm on him and do this stupid thing that Americans do and say it's okay. Americans always think everything's okay, no matter how much we've fucked things up. And I realized in that moment, oh no, he's choking because it's not okay. He's choking on the recognition that it happened in the previous scene that I'd shot 6 months earlier with him, that he'll never get over. He'll never be able to bridge the gap between the horror that he's done to people and the stories, the lies he's told himself to cope with it. And and he's choking on that fear. It's like nausea coming from terror. The word in Indonesian for guilt and fear is the same. Not the same. There's guilt and there's fear, but you can use, at least in North Sumatra, takut, fear, for guilt. And he leaves, and when we had to cut the film down, when we realized that distributors would take the 90-minute broadcast version of the film so they could put it on more screens, when we saw that last shot of him standing there in the cut down, it felt psychological in the wrong way, like it was a psychological ending as opposed to a political ending. And I realized somehow we hadn't overcome the boundary between we tell this political story and then there's this character in it who goes through this journey. And I think in the longer version, somehow Anwar, I hope, becomes a vessel. As much as he goes through his own path through the film, he also is this vessel for all this rot, all this corruption, all this emptiness around him. And I felt we could end on that final shot of him, and we've overcome, and not have it be, it is a psychological ending, of course, but I hope it's still an ending about the whole society and about all of us.
And the duck, I will come to you in a sec, the duck with the broken leg.
Yeah. Anwar's a nice guy, actually, and his grandson had hurt the duck. And you know, on set, when someone would skin their knee or fall or whatever, he was always the first person to run over and make sure the person was okay. And maybe also because Anwar was trying to move on, it was particularly disturbing to him that his grandson had hurt this duck. The grandson hurt the duck because he was afraid of ducks. And the duck, he was feeding it, and it had like nipped him a little. Of course, it doesn't hurt when he hit the duck, and the duck had broken its wing. And Anwar was trying to teach him to apologize. What can I say about it? But we use that. In the editing, it's interesting. When we come out of the campaigns and we knew we had to get into Anwar's nightmares, we have a replay of him with feeding the duck, smashing snails, and he's just alone. And that, of course, was to bring back the echo of his conscience before we go into the nightmare scene.
Did you...
Next, you mentioned towards the end the sense of the consequences. Obviously, with the screening and the threats, there is a possibility now of reopening conflict. All these thoughts, I'm sure, crossed your mind during the process. And on what did you deal with the possibilities of that?
I think the answer to that has to do somehow with how I dealt with it. Well, first I would say that I think there's really I maybe didn't say this, the film has opened this space where the whole society is talking about this now. And certainly much more than they ever did. And it's no longer acceptable for perpetrators in Indonesia to boast about what they did as a result of this. So you won't go and find an Anwar anymore in Indonesia. And I think the whole Indonesian human rights community has a fairly constructive approach to what they want. They want a presidential apology because they can't rewrite the school curriculum, which still justifies all these things, if the state doesn't say it was wrong. They want a truth commission, but in a sense they've already produced the report upon which this 850-page report that is the core of that effort, and it's already online, available to all Indonesians. They want a reconciliation process. They want tribunals for the highest ranking commanders. No one wants tribunals for people like Anwar because they know there's 10,000 Anwars out there, and that could lead to civil war or to fighting. But maybe people at the level of the newspaper publisher and above. He was the commander of the killings for a whole region. Most people are too old or are dead, but there should be tribunals in absentia as a kind of ritual, not for vendetta, but not for revenge, but as a ritual by which the society says these things are forbidden and not to be celebrated. I think I knew that there was not really a risk. It's the way that I undertook this without considering myself, wondering if it was totally irresponsible to undertake this because it could lead to things that would be totally out of control, was somehow it's about fluency in a situation, and why some films require a lot of time and a lot of investment. It's not just about being fluent in the language, it's about fluency in the culture, in the institutions dealing with these things, having strong connections with the human rights community, the cultural community, the survivors organizations, understanding throughout the whole process what they want screening material to them, seeing what they think the reactions will be, screening the cuts of the film to survivors and human rights advocates and other people to try and understand how best can we bring this film out, what's the best discourse, the most constructive discourse to tell around the film. When Tempo magazine called me and said they're doing a special edition about it and they needed a long interview with me, I said immediately, please don't put Anwar's picture on the cover because he'll be singled out and scapegoated. And they said, no, of course we're not planning to do that. We're doing something much bigger. And they told me, and I kind of knew they would do something bigger. So it's about fluency. It's about, just as if you were, and it's a little bit like activism. If you were an activist here, you would take strategic actions judged based on a fluency in the situation, which I think is often hard for filmmakers to develop when they come into a situation from outside on the basis of other people's work just to make the film. After other people have done the work here, because maybe no one had done the work, no one had done the research, I became very fluent through the process. And that's also why I credited in the end my production manager, my assistant director, this one guy, he was my production manager, assistant director, assistant editor, main creative sounding board, second cameraman, as my co-director, because I felt somehow the conception of this whole thing, although yes, I was the filmmaker, it would have been impossible had I not had that.
Were you actually shooting then?
Yeah, I'm not the main. We couldn't afford a cinematographer the whole time. So, for example, this shot, we had a cinema when we were doing the big fiction scenes. This was one of them. We had the cinematographer down there shooting the dancing girls, and I was shooting this from the side, and he was screaming at me, "Get the camera down here! I need 2 cameras." And he couldn't see the storm, you see. So I was saying, no, I'm not coming down. You're going to have to wait. And he wanted me to come because he knew it was getting bad weather. And he thought we're going to be rained out, and then it's going to get dark, and in the tropics the sun drops like a rock across the horizon. So we were going to lose our chance. And I was like, no, I'm staying right where I am. But so about a third of the film, or about half the film maybe, I had a DP, and half the film I was the main cameraman.
Yeah.
I'd like to know a little bit more about your background, how you came to this film, and what gave you the courage to work in such an imaginative, different way.
As I mentioned briefly earlier, I never, I didn't come to film as a documentary maker. I studied film with my mentor was this really wild, anarchic filmmaker, Dusan Makavejev. Do any of you know who he is? No. Wow. What a pity. No, he's a Yugoslav filmmaker. He made some great films. One of them is called WR, Mysteries of the Organism.
Oh yeah, I saw that.
Another is Sweet Movie, which is utterly bonkers and too much. An earlier one called Innocence Unprotected. They're all released in the UK. You can get them on DVD. But, except maybe Sweet Movie. No, Sweet Movie was banned here, but maybe it's out. It's great. And it is sweet. But I was always interested in how our reality... I came to filmmaking from theoretical physics and then philosophy. And I was interested in how our reality, what appears to be normal, is utterly unfathomable, including this. What are we doing here? Really? At every level, like why do we exist, down to what are we doing, why are you listening to me, what have you just done watching this, what did I do, spending 8 years to make this for you. So I felt like there's something about storytelling and fiction and fantasy that makes our normal reality what it is, and yet to cope with our reality, we blinker ourselves to all the undercurrents of fantasy. If I pick up a 10-pound note and blow my nose into it, you're shocked only because we have a story we tell about that 10-pound note. And what that story is so complicated that I think we'd struggle, any one of us, to really say what it is. Why it's money, what is money. So that it commands a day's labor of somebody in China, I mean, it's just hard to fathom. So when you think, and I think we cope with this kind of maelstrom almost it's like string theory. Like the world is bound up, all these hidden dimensions, 13 hidden dimensions wrapped up on each other, and we just see something relatively simple. Similarly, all these stories tightly coiled onto each other that make the world what it is. Well, I was always interested in sort of taking away the blinkers so we could see the story. Taking away the blinders so we could see this, all this stuff that makes our reality what it is. These little tiny, molecules that make the reality what it is. And so I think of this method as something I was developing, giving people this. So first I was doing fiction, combining fiction and documentary. There's a crazy film I made. I'm not sure it's good at all. I haven't seen it in 15 years, but it's coming. They're screening it at the ICA because of the act of killing. It's called The Entire History of the Louisiana Purchase. It has nothing to do with the Louisiana Purchase. But so that was, which was combining archive and fiction and documentary. That was my first film. And then I thought I was going to do fiction, and I started writing. And I moved to the UK on a scholarship in '97, and I had a producer here who had produced a lot of films through the BFI, but then the BFI stopped, and it became this very laborious process of writing. I had no track record. My work was mental. No one, and I just was writing scripts and rewriting scripts and rewriting scripts, and I found it totally, the script isn't the work. So I became more and more frustrated, and I realized if this is what fiction involves, I don't want to do it. And around that time, it became possible to shoot digital video and edit yourself. And I discovered the work of Jean Rouch around that time too, who we call invented the word cinema verite, but what he was doing has nothing to do with what we call cinema verite. He was giving, and it's a real pity we use that word to describe direct cinema, fly on the wall documentary, which I talked about earlier. Really, cinema verite was about giving people the space to stage themselves in some way, and he did it in a pretty rudimentary, simple way because the technology was clunky. I mean, he was shooting 16 millimeter. If you shot The Act of Killing on 16 millimeter film, you'd need an airplane hangar for the material. So but it was about staging yourself, people staging themselves on camera as a way of making manifest how they see themselves and want to be seen. And I started exploring performance in film, so as a way of trying to look at all the little stories that are beneath the surface, but that make up the surface, the macroscopic surface of our reality. And I got some community arts grants to do these experiments with people who would be staging themselves, and was working in a film collective with Christine Cynn and Andrea Zimmerman and a guy named Michael Wamidimo in London called Vision Machine. We did some work with that. Then we were asked to make the globalization tapes, and it connects up now with that's where I was developing these experimental documentaries I mentioned, or methods I mentioned. Then this was a very hard film to fund, in that when I went to the BBC, I don't remember which commissioning editor, or perhaps I'd rather not say, but I went to the BBC with the material when I was shooting all of the perpetrators. I remember the response very well. It was, "I don't want my strand awash with atrocity." So he said, we got a no, and I didn't know anyone outside of the UK, and I don't remember if we approached Channel 4. But then I felt I had to keep going back. I couldn't wait for a long financing period, so I won't tell you how we financed the shoots to go back, but it was not 100% kosher. And then I shot, but no one was harmed. No one was harmed. And then
Basically extortion.
yeah, go see the Chinese people in the market, they paid for the film. Then I went, and then when we met Anwar and people were saying, and he started saying what he wanted to do, I realized that would be way beyond our means. And it's worth pausing in a moment. Why Anwar? I think the motor for Anwar's reenactment, the whole process, is him running away from what he's done, trying to consolidate that same denial that's there on the roof. He can dance on the roof because he's in denial of the moral meaning of what happened there. But he's haunted, so he's trying to it's like reenacting this, dramatizing this, is so tasteless that it is an insistence on his denial. It reasserts his denial. It's a way of consolidating his denial, and therefore, in that sense, his conscience is the motor for the whole process. And so it's not such a surprise that at the end of the film, after the bogus confession, where he says, now I feel what my victims feel, these reenactments, this process becomes the prism through which he somehow recognizes his fractured self. But I knew that this process would be beyond our means. But by then I'm American, I have a Japanese partner. I came on a scholarship to the UK. To stay in the UK, I needed a visa, so I did a PhD. Because I couldn't bring my partner, it's a he, so I couldn't bring him to America because they wouldn't give him a visa because he's a he. Now they might, because they've changed the law last week, which is great. But now it's not my home anymore, so. But I therefore had this PhD, so I was able to apply for an academic grant. So I went with all this material, which I could argue was of world historical importance, as I said to you earlier. I was able to argue that to the Arts and Humanities Research Council, tell them that the perpetrators wanted to do this, that it would shed light on these issues. I had done a PhD on the perpetrators, so I had some credentials. There were lots of Indonesians and Indonesianists who were prominent, who wrote letters of support, and we were able to get an academic grant to fund the main part of the production. Because when you went to the BBC and said, okay, it won't be awash with atrocity because there'll be song and dance numbers, then they really didn't want it. Then they said, forget it. So then we were able to raise regular film funding on the basis of most of the material being shot. And I would just give you advice. Follow your heart. Do what you think is right. Find a way. Don't make films that are stillborn on arrival, because dead on arrival, because you've followed someone else's tracks and methods.
Yeah, absolutely. My favourite facts from the BBC, this is a few years ago, said there will be no menstrual blood on the BBC. So no menstrual blood and no atrocities.
So does
Now we know.
Anwar's dick count as menstrual blood?
Well,
No.
I don't think that.
It's not menstrual.
Well,
It isn't.
kinda,
It
but-
isn't. It isn't. And
So we have 10 minutes,
Okay.
and what I'm going to do is ask all of you to ask your questions, you four, and then you'll
Yeah.
try and answer them all really quickly, and then we get on to the
yeah, it
fish.
sounds wacky, but we
Okay.
did it last night.
Yeah.
It's good.
So everybody who has a question has to ask it really quickly, and you'll answer all in one. Yeah.
This will shape your life as well. How do you move on from it?
Good question. Yeah.
Did you expect that he at some point would realize everything that he's done?
Yeah.
How they feel about it?
Yeah. Making. Yeah.
Why make a film in Indonesia about a perpetrator and not one in the West?
Is that it? No. One more.
How much is planned and how much does this kind of write itself and kind of take its own life?
Any more?
Okay. One more. Last one.
I love this. Oh no,
Yeah,
that's it.
well,
One more.
we're
One
going
more.
to do the
I'll tell
fish for sure.
As a viewer, I was watching the market scene, Chinese, and I felt like I was taking part in that crime. You mentioned that you gave the money back.
Mm.
I feel quite relieved.
And explained why we did it,
yeah, and you explained.
which in hindsight I shouldn't have done because it endangered all of us, actually.
And I was just wondering if you ever went to meet any of the victims' families to pass on information.
Okay, so that's the victims. Okay, very, very last one because we have to. Yeah.
Very short. You've got all this material, like any of the other outtakes going to be somewhere.
Okay.
Can you
Right.
help me remember some
Yep,
of them? I'll
I
do my
can.
best.
Okay, how are you going to move on from this?
Okay, I'm going to try and wrap that with
Yeah.
the question of the archive and the victims too.
Yeah.
It's of course when you make a film like this, when you give 8 years of yourself to something, and then also it sets a fairly high bar, at least in some eyes of the people who like it. It's scary to move on. That's of course human. I think that we in documentary have not done I forget the word documentary. It's shitty. Let's say nonfiction. We have not done enough with self-consciousness and self-awareness as a resource. we try and hide it by getting people to act normal. But the moment people are filmed, they're self-aware, they're self-conscious. And that offers this kind of prismic insight into all the stories they tell themselves about who they are. So you make, as I said earlier, what drew me to this was, draws me to filmmaking is the ability to look at what makes up the surface, the stories below the surface, making something previously invisible visible, like putting reality through a prism. So I want to continue with this method, and I want to confront my fear of death at the same time, because it haunts me. I think that's a good project to take into my middle age. So that'll be my next big project. I think it's unlikely to be dealing with mass atrocity. It's likely to be dealing with our addiction to fear. And it's likely to be in my home ground in the United States. And it's likely to use methods that are very related, but will appear different and more dreamlike when you don't have this big kind of factual introduction that you have to convey about a genocide, about a regime, about a political system, which requires that this in some way starts very much a documentary. Now, that said, that would be a very scary thing to be starting after such an absorbing project. I have many, many, many ideas, many notes, but to start from zero would be hard now, and especially it'd be easier if I could make another film in Indonesia, but I can't go back safely. So, but I luckily have another film shot, which I'm editing now. I'm about halfway through the editing. It's about a family of survivors with whom I was working from the beginning, who through my work with perpetrators, like many survivors who asked me if I had information about how their loved ones died, found out how their loved ones died. And the youngest son in this family was born after the killings, conceived as the replacement for his dead brother. The way that brother was killed was such that the mother had to hand him over, knowing he was going to be killed. She had no choice, but she had to live with that for the rest of her life. Then she has another son. She sees him as a replacement. He grows up with that burden. He now has young children. The children are being brainwashed in school that this was all their fault. The killer's kids are in the same school. He has to somehow, it's about the silence and the experience of the survivors, and he tries to, so he can live with all of this, he wants to see if he can make the survivors take responsibility, the perpetrators take responsibility and feel remorse, and he visits everybody involved with his brother's death. He's an optician, so he starts by testing their eyes while they tell what they did to his brother. It's my next film. It's the second film in a diptych, if you like, with this. It gives, because it's sort of less extravagant, it has space for a kind of formal exploration, which is very, very satisfying for me now, about silence and about rhythm and about, and it's, I think, has a kind of magical tempo, so I hope. And that should be out soon. And then the archive I'm also handing over to scholars to be able to draw from, so the transcripts of everything I've made available, and then footage as needed. And we are exploring ways of making the archive of those 23 hours of edited scenes available as well, so that people can explore them, analyze them. And I'm going to speak to the head of the Showa archive when I get to LA next week.
So I think you answered some of the questions before, but is there anything you want to say about women before you get on to the
fish? I mean, I think there's this interesting thing with the with the woman who doesn't, with the woman who's possessed. She's the wife of a perpetrator, but she's old enough to have had her own experiences, and no, this is not a film about those experiences. But I think it's a film about the ambiguous position in which women are placed by a very, very, part of the anti-communist propaganda that the government has told ever since involved demonizing women and demonizing dangerous sexuality. It's sort of demonizing women as having a kind of dangerous sexuality. There was a lie told about the killings in which they said that an orgy, a mob of communist women sort of committed this kind of sadomasochistic orgy where they were slicing the genitals of army generals. It's all nonsense. But there is this misogynist myth, and some of the crazy stuff that Herman does to Anwar is sort of a reworking of that.
Right.
The film doesn't really deal with that. Why did I not make a film in the States? I was planning to, in fact. But I felt that why did I not make a film about perpetrators in the West, you asked me? I was planning to. when I came across this story. And as I said earlier, I felt this situation where it was as though the Nazis had won, and there was a possibility for a kind of insight into impunity, was something that demanded my attention. I had to do it. I made one of the very first times that killers took me to the place where they killed and showed me in their simple way how they did it. It was 2 death squad members who took me down to a river where they would haul busloads of people every night, cut off their heads with the help of with an army guard, and dump them in the river. 10,500 people were killed at that spot. They show me how they did it. Then afterwards, the older one takes out a stills camera and from his pocket and says, "Now I ask my sound guy to take pictures of them posing with the river flowing behind them," while he gives the thumbs up and the V for victory. That was in February 2004. In April I came back to London with all this material. It was overwhelming. I was disturbed. And then in April 2004, photographs of American soldiers in Iraq posing, giving the thumbs up and the V for victory appeared in the news at Abu Ghraib. And I made this film contemporaneously with an evolving nightmare at home, where the government was basically celebrating torture. And this is in part my response to that. And I think Americans draw that connection immediately. You asked, and I think America as a character, which I mentioned supported the killings at the beginning. I didn't want to make a historical film. I wanted it to be a film about now. So I couldn't go into the details of that in the film, but America is sort of as a cultural vacuum, for lack of a better word, and like a vacuum, it sucks things into it. As a cultural vacuum kind of haunts, I think, the whole film, and that was very deliberate. Question about how I maintain my moral position, that's really hard. I don't know. I try my best. And every award the film wins is, of course, gets the film in the news again in Indonesia. And that is, and of course I'm a human being, and it's pleasurable to win an award. So these are conflicted issues. I try my best and I try and live a decent life, and I'm not perfect. Was there anything I left out?
The fish.
The fish.
The love.
I wasn't expecting it, and I remember 2 things. I wasn't expecting it because to answer the other question I didn't answer, I didn't plan. Things had to evolve as they evolved, and the method was like painting a picture. Anwar would paint a little, step back from the canvas of his self-portrait, look at it, think about what to paint next. So we would only plan 1 or 2 big scenes ahead. And I wasn't hoping for Anwar to reach that point. I think that's why the film is not sentimental. If I were, I think it would have inevitably become tainted by some sentimentality. It was not. He's trying to run away from his pain. I'm trying to I'm trying to expose a regime of impunity. There's a tension between those 2 projects. It's that tension that animates the whole film, and the editing, which is a kind of tightrope between empathy and repulsion. The repulsion is the expose. The empathy is seeing a man trying to deal with his guilt without being able to ever consciously recognize it as guilt. I think that the film, it would have been irresponsible to set out on a psychodrama, because I'm not a therapist, and a therapist's loyalty must be entirely to the patient. My loyalty was to this community of survivors with whom I started all of this, and with whom now in the second film I'm finishing this journey. The fish. Is that it?
Yeah.
Great. The fish. The Fish was a seafood restaurant in the 80s and 90s. It closed down in 1997. I was driving with Anwar looking for a location for a musical number that he wanted to do, which is based on Peggy Lee's song, Is That All There Is? That's a song about disappointment. It has spoken verses, which are like, is that all there is to going to a circus? Is that all there is to falling in love? Anwar, in the same sound booth where Herman does the drumming, we re-recorded that song, and Anwar re-recorded the verses to be, is that all there is to killing? Is that all there is to making a movie? We were driving looking for a location. Came across a bend. We saw this enormous concrete goldfish. We were all gobsmacked. I said, can we use this for anything? Not thinking Anwar would say that. Also, as I said, I only planned a couple shoots ahead, so I just file it in the back of my mind. Anwar said it's perfect for the fish, it's perfect for Is That All There Is, because it's so sad and disappointing. And my life has been so disappointing. And the song is about disappointment. And here it is, this sort of product of human folly, or product of human fantasy, sitting there sadly witnessing the world go by. And we shot the musical number there, and we edited the musical number, and it was too thin and too silly. But there were these moments of pure poetry from the shoot, which are not fiction scenes. They're like moments of people making a fiction scene. You see a choreographer shouting 1, 2, 3, 4. You see Herman getting bored and starting to sing a song to the camera. You see this shot, which is more that you couldn't use in the musical because it was too much of a master shot, too big a shot, and too moody. I felt they were these moments of pure poetry where about how we as human beings get lost in our storytelling. And the last thing, the reason why I wanted this to be the last question, was there's another piece of the fish which isn't in the film, which is that lake. That lake is in fact the most important spot in our history as a species. And now you all think I'm full of shit. But it is. It's called Lake Toba. I only found this out after I finished the film. It was a supervolcano. It's a crater lake. It was a supervolcano that erupted between 50 and 75,000 years ago. And human beings had been around already for nearly 1 million years at that point. There were millions of us all over the world. And this supervolcano erupted. It caused the Toba supercatastrophe. The Toba catastrophe. It killed, the volcanic winter that followed, killed all of the humans on Earth. Apart from a band of somewhere between 1,000 and 10,000, depending on whether it happened. If it happened 50,000 years ago, it was 10,000. If it happened 75,000 years ago, it was 1,000. It killed everybody but this one small band of humans somewhere in the world, we don't know where. And the way we know this is geneticists can look at every human on Earth, a Maori in New Zealand, someone in the Amazon, someone, us, anyone, and find we only have 75,000 to 50,000 to 75,000 years of evolution between us. We all come from one small group not long ago, and yet the fossil record shows we've been around much longer. So when geologists try and account for what could have killed everybody 50 to 75,000 years ago, this is what they found. It caused the Toba bottleneck. If just as it's an evolutionary bottleneck, if you were to try and repopulate the African savannas with the black rhinos that are not in that death museum, you would find that we have put black rhinos through an evolutionary bottleneck. Hopefully they come out the other end of that bottleneck one day. But this is the Toba bottleneck. So really at the end of that film, in that final shot, they are dancing their danse macabre at the very edge of the abyss.
Well, thank you very, very much. Amazing.